Hey there everyone, this is Samuel Johnson and welcome back to the Spider-Verse Retrospectives. Apologies this wasn't released yesterday, but due to a dog-related incident involving a chewed-up ring, I didn't really feel like in a good mood to do a vlog, so I decided to delay it to today. But of course, we're still doing it, so what are we going to be looking at? Well, remember back when I looked at Marvel Voices Spider-Verse #1, when I said that there would be 2 comics where I'd be cheating with the whole needs to be released in trade format rule, with that comic being the first? Well, today we're going to be looking at the second comic that breaks that rule, as we take a look at Web of Carnage #1, provided to us by mycomicshop.com. Check them out. They have a lot of good stuff on standby. But my point is this. Yep, this comic's a cheat. This comic, to my knowledge, has not been released in a trade format, and if it has, well, then the trade really is not related to anything Spider-Verse related, but more or less just Carnage related. With that said, though, this issue is essentially like an intermediary issue. Sorry, Ginny just came in. It's essentially like the bridge between End of the Spider-Verse and the next storyline we're going to be looking at, Death of the Venomverse. As, well, this comic not only reveals what happened to Morlun after the events of End of the Spider-Verse, but it also kind of sort of sets up what's going to happen in Death of the Venomverse. So, I kind of sort of count it as part of the whole finale era kind of thing. With that said, though, is the comic even good in its own right? Is it actually worthy of being a part of the whole Spider-Verse fold? Well, let's take a look at it and find out. So, well, what's the plot? Well, this one kind of requires a bit of pre-continuity to understand. Stuff that happened prior to this book, as, well, this book is kind of meant to act as an epilogue to the then ongoing Carnage series. There's a new one going on that actually does follow up from stuff from Death of the Venomverse, but this was supposed to essentially be the follow-up to the Carnage ongoing that came before that. And, well, it's kind of a big thing. So, for starters, but in between when we last saw Venom in the previous Venomverse storyline, a new being had made himself known in the Marvel Universe, an exceedingly powerful entity that went by the name of Null, the god of the symbiotes and the King in Black. Like I said, he was very powerful, and at one point he did invade the Marvel Universe and cause a lot of hell. Now, I don't know the specifics about how he was beaten or taken down and so forth, as I haven't read that story yet, but from what I can gather, after he was essentially dethroned, so to speak, a new King in Black was named in his stead, and that King in Black was Eddie Brock, the original host of the Venom symbiote. Now, from what I can gather at the time, Eddie is no longer the host for said symbiote. From what I can gather, I think his son Dylan is now the current host, but don't quote me on that. But put simply, Eddie is now the head honcho of the symbiotes. He is the King in Black now, and he wields the sword All Black, the Necro Sword. Well, the Carnage symbiote is not exactly happy about this. In fact, he's kind of angry that Eddie is the one on top, and so, to try and be able to match Eddie in power so he can properly dethrone him, he has gone through heaven and hell just to get more powerful, both figuratively and literally. He's been to various other realms and begun accumulating power. Even managed to forge his own weapon to counter All Black the Necro Sword, called All Blood, the Necro Spear. And ultimately, basically through his journeys, Carnage has actually learned how to absorb the powers of others by killing them. Most likely with the Necro Spear, but don't quote me on that. And as a result, he has tussled with various supervillains and absorbed their power. Specifically, he's absorbed the dimension-hopping abilities of the Spot, as well as gaining the more viscous power of the Hydro Man. And as a result, Carnage has now become so powerful that he doesn't even need a host anymore. He can essentially just do everything he can as the slimy symbiote, even giving himself his own humanoid form without the need for someone to be in the driver's seat. So, essentially, Carnage has gotten a lot stronger, although this also means that he's no longer bonded with Cletus Cassidy. In fact, to my knowledge, at this point in time, Cletus Cassidy was dead. I mean, sort of. His symbiote codex was uploaded to a symbiote kind of armor that Iron Man made at one point. I don't know. It's a whole thing that I recommend you just read some of the Carnage books in order to figure out. But ultimately, the Carnage symbiote wanted to get more powerful. It wanted to be able to take Eddie Brock down and essentially take the throne for himself, but it required a bit more aid to do that. And so This comic is technically where things get started, although Carnage is not alone for the ride. As part of his ongoing series, there was an ongoing character who was always on Carnage's path, a detective by the name of John Shade, and somehow, again, it does not explain. It's kind of vague in the book whether this happens in this book or happened in Carnage's previous ongoing. John Shade and the Carnage symbiote finally did cross paths, and now John is playing host to the symbiote, as ultimately the two of them are now one, and well, now Carnage bonded to John Shade is now traversing the multiverse, which is actually where this issue begins, as Carnage and John are kind of getting acquainted with one another. We're kind of becoming a part of one another, with Carnage kind of looking more into John's mind, seeing what his business is, and apparently part of the reason he's been seeking John that John sought Carnage out was because, as part of him learning about Carnage's whole dimension hopping plan, he even wound up seeking out Annie Mae Parker in the Web of Life and Destiny. So there is something going on there. But either way, the two of them are now one, and so Carnage decides that if he's going to go on his whole journey to become even more powerful, then he needs to start jumping through worlds in order to figure things out. And ultimately, one of those portals is what's supposed to lead Carnage to hit what he thinks is the Earth 616 universe, but rather, due to the influence of John Shade, Carnage kind of misses the mark by a bit as they end up on Earth 31. And, well, it's here where we learn what happened to Morlun after he made himself scarce at the end of the Spider-Verse, as it turned out that he managed to use whatever bit of power he had left to open a portal to this world, and, yeah, he's not doing so well. Basically, after Cindy Moon slashed him with the totem dagger, his mind has been all over the place. Not only is he weak in body, but his mind is very addled. He can barely figure out where the hell he is and what's going on, and the only things keeping him grounded are just like snippets of his former life, the connections to the Web of Life and Destiny, and how he's keeping himself alive at all is by scrounging for whatever food he can find. Sorry, Chingy just jumped off the bed. Which includes, of course, little spiders that he can find in the subway. However, as we see Morlun as he's in the middle of chowing down on one of those spiders, that's when Carnage appears and wonders where the hell he's gone. And as such, the two of them become acquainted with one another, and so Carnage at first is a little interested in Morlun, especially since he can smell death on him. But Morlun, when he senses Carnage and realizes he was following a thread, so to speak, Morlun begins recalling the events of End of the Spider-Verse and how he wound up getting here. And when Carnage hears that, his opinion of Morlun quickly changes as he goes from interesting to just straight up boring, as Carnage thinks he's heard this story at least once before, so he decides to pretty much fuck this noise and go somewhere else. That is until Morlun says that he can sense that Carnage is hunting for another spider, one that's a bit more venomous. At which point, this gets Carnage's attention as Morlun begins talking about how he did once have an ability that would allow Carnage to, well, seek out his prey, so to speak. Actually hunt them down and get them all, and pretty much just get them right where he wants them. And that is actually an ability that apparently was inherently connected to the Inheritors. Hold on one second. Again, apologies. But yeah, essentially, this was an ability that the Inheritors had that was called the Inheritors trait. Basically, whenever an Inheritor actually made contact with someone that they intended to hunt, then ultimately, no matter where their prey ran, they'd be able to find them. No matter the reality, no matter the time period, no matter where they went, they'd be able to catch up to them. And the thing is, while Morlun has gotten weaker, a lot of his abilities were dispersed back into the web. After all, much of his power was tied into all the spider totem life energy that he had absorbed, and since all of those spiders were released back into the web and restored to life, then that means that some of Morlun's abilities have also been let loose across the web. And well, it turns out there is one particular Spidey in the multiverse who wound up getting the Inheritors trait. Which is why we're back on Earth 31, because you see, the spider that had gotten the Inheritor trait was Kraven the Hunter Spider. And yeah, Earth 31 is his stomping ground. And we actually, and the comic even cuts away as we see him in the middle of a hunt, as he's actually hunting down this world's Venom. And of course, he's using all the standard tricks he would normally use. He has booby-trapped arrows, he keeps setting traps for him. And of course, with Kraven having all the proportionate strength, speed, and agility of a spider and all that stuff, he and Venom are kind of on an even keel. Though Venom is clearly able to match him somewhat, though eventually as the pair tussle, Venom ends up punching Kraven into a building. Although upon landing in said building, we see a crackle of red lightning over in the sky before we see a red light inside the building. Before Kraven actually shoots out a red laser right at Venom's face, which, yeah, that's meant to be implied that that's part of the inheritor traits because, well, by becoming, or by getting the inheritor trait, Kraven is, by all intents and purposes, also technically an inheritor now. Hold on, I'm just adjusting this. This annoys me. As such, he's a lot more than just a regular spider. And as such, as Kraven and Venom's continue duking it out, we learn another little tidbit about this universe. As it turns out, that little blast to the face managed to peel back enough symbiote skin from Venom that we can actually see who the Venom symbiote is bonded to in this reality. And it's not Eddie Brock, it's Cletus Cassidy. Why? I really have no idea. It's just that Cletus is Venom in this universe. But my point is that's actually an interesting little tidbit, and not far from the battle, we see Carnage and Morlun appear from a portal, and the instant Carnage realizes that this world's Venom is Cletus, well, he's now suddenly a lot more interested, as Carnage has history with both entities in that mix, and suddenly he thinks, well, maybe I do want to get in on this. However, Morlun immediately wants to take this opportunity to try and go after Carnage because, well, he needs some kind of sustenance. But the instant he tries to take a bite out of the red symbiote goo, whatever, well, it actually revolts him and causes him to, well, to shrink back because he doesn't sense the spider's life essence in Carnage. All he senses is death and carnage, which even Carnage kind of says, "Congratulations, Morlun, you're now on the same page as everyone else." At which point, Carnage kind of abandons Morlun as he jumps in between the battle with Venom and Kraven. However, as Carnage is in the middle of all this, he sees Kraven with all of his abilities, and suddenly he thinks, you know what, maybe you're the reason I'm here, aren't you? If I can get your abilities, hunting down Venom will be a cinch. Unfortunately, in the midst of said battle, John Shade starts kind of fighting back against the Carnage symbiote, because it turns out the major reason he came to this universe wasn't because he wanted to find Kraven, it was actually because he wanted to find Cletus Cassidy. He wanted to find Venom. And as a result, John and Carnage end up kind of end up clashing with one another. And while Carnage tells John that he can't resist him, John says that he's aware, but he can at least cause enough problems that maybe Carnage will be a team player. And while Carnage concedes that might be the case, at this point he thinks, you know what, this ain't worth it, not doing this shit, and so he just dumps John and then goes after Kraven. Pretty much just leaving the ordinary detective to duke it out against the crazed serial killer with the black symbiote goo on him. Although, from what we can gather, apparently John's doing pretty well, so, you know what, good on him. But either way, Carnage and Kraven actually continue duking it out, and it turns out that apparently in Carnage's travels, he's built up a resistance to Sonic and Fire, which I'm going to bring back up later when I talk about Death of the Venomverse, but whatever. So basically, any of the weapons that Kraven brought to deal with Venom are not as effective against Carnage. However, things eventually come to a head as Kraven ends up pulling out a bomb that's made from Sonic's Fire and various other materials from around the world, including certain tonics and even some metal from Wakanda. Point is, it's a weapon that was specifically made to kill a symbiote like Venom, so he immediately throws it at Carnage, and well, it blows the red symbiote up, but good. So at first, Kraven thinks, good, I won. Everything's all said and done, until the various bits of Carnage begin reforming. As such, Kraven's a little shocked by this, but he doesn't really have any time to react as Carnage regains his form and grabs Kraven with the intent of killing him and absorbing his powers. However, it's at this point that Morlun enters the fray because, well, Morlun doesn't want to lose said power, and so he shoves Carnage aside as he grabs Kraven and begins siphoning out his life force to get his power back. At which point he starts feeling stronger, he starts feeling greater, he starts feeling more encompassed, and as Carnage sees this, he begins realizing, you know what? You can keep it. But though he does do Kraven at least a bit of a solid by knocking Morlun off before he can completely siphon out his life force. As such, Morlun does regain enough of his powers that he's able to kind of regain his sanity, as well as the inheritor abilities that Kraven had absorbed through the Web of Life and Destiny. But Kraven is still alive and kicking. And ultimately, Carnage just tells Morlun that he's thankful that he met Morlun here, because as he saw how addicted Morlun was to having all that power, Carnage realizes that if he tried something similar by getting the inheritor trait, then ultimately he wouldn't be able to become the King in Black. And as a result, Carnage decides that if he really wants to take Venom, if he wants to take Eddie's throne and wants to become the new king, then he needs to prove himself. He can't prove himself by taking down Venom, because, well, fighting him won't make him better. He just needs to be better. He needs to become stronger on his own merits, and to do that, he doesn't need the inheritors of traits. And so, as a thank you for Moreland for showing him that, he pretty much just says that he allowed Moreland to leave, though that's a limited time offer. As such, Moreland takes the offer as he opens a portal, but he does warn Carnage that he hopes the multiverse is big enough to contain them both. In the meantime, after Moreland leaves, Carnage sets his sights back on Kraven, though Kraven is not interested in fighting Carnage and decides that he wants to go back to hunting Venom, though he does tell Carnage that he wishes him luck on hunting his prey and hopes that their paths never cross again as well. In the meantime, back with John, Shade, and Venom, we see that John has again actually done well for himself, as he's managed to lure Venom into a building that's covered in oil, and all John needs to do is just drop a lighter and set the whole place ablaze. And while Cletus tells John that he could easily grab the lighter before it hits anything before it can hit the oil, well, John tries appealing to the little psychopath in Cletus and says that I think the part of you that burned down St. Estes would actually happily love to see me burn, even if it means you burning along with it. And it does almost seem to do something until Kraven comes in and decks Cletus in the face. At which point he tells John to get lost, this is his fight, and while John wishes to intervene, that's when Carnage comes back around and he opens up a set of portals, as he's pretty much deciding to show some mercy to John, and tells him that since Carnage was the one that brought him here, he'll help John get back to his home, though his portal will close shortly, so whether John wants to stay or leave, it's up to him. As such, John starts thinking it over, because, well, part of the reason he came here was to duke it out with Cletus, but he finally decides that he'd rather just go home, and so after Carnage goes through his portal, John steps through his, and the both of them leave Earth 31. As such, the comic ends as we cut back to the main Marvel Universe, as we see that John is back in his day-to-day life. He's now feeling more content with himself, he's feeling nice, and ultimately, he thinks he's come more to terms with his darkness, especially with his experiences with Carnage. Though even he admits that maybe he's kind of glad that it's all over. In the meantime, thanks to all that, he's been able to more refine his attitude, been able to better stalk his prey, and we even see that he's gotten better at his job as he manages to save a woman from a mugger before she gets hurt, and all he really gets to show for it is that he got his cut across his face from the mugger's knife. Although John may not be as rid of Carnage as he hopes, for as we see John putting the mugger in handcuffs, we see the cut that the mugger left him begin to heal rather quickly, and the blood that began to drip is actually moving a little. So, yeah, John isn't exactly out of the park, that isn't exactly out of the woods there. So, yeah. But anyway, yeah, that was Web of Carnage, and my opinion on it, it's all right. I think that if you really want to fully appreciate this comic, then you kind of need to read the Carnage ongoing that came before it, which, since I'm not reading the Carnage ongoing, and I even openly admit that I only read modern comics if there's something there that grabs my interest, I don't really know anything about Carnage. And before you say, well, do you want to read about Carnage? To that I give an unsteady maybe. I don't know. The thing is, Carnage is really one of those characters that it's kind of hard to see him in a leading role, because Carnage, by his very definition, is a psychotic monster. Even if you take Cletus Cassidy out of the equation, the Carnage symbiote is violent, angry, loves spreading death and destruction just because it can. And part of the whole deal with Carnage's ongoing series is, especially the one that preceded this one, is the one that came before this. I think I might have used the right terminology. I don't know. The point is, the whole point of that one was that Carnage was going across the Marvel Universe, bonding to different hosts, and essentially causing more death and destruction in his ongoing quest to become more powerful, so that he could eventually take on Eddie Brock. So in that regard, Carnage as a leading character doesn't really feel like someone that you could really follow and get acquainted with and all that jazz. But with that said, the comic itself is still fine. The thing is, while Carnage as a leading character is definitely an iffy choice, it's not a bad, it's still pretty cool to see him doing his thing. Carnage is one of those villains that definitely is kind of scary no matter what scenario you put him in. And the idea of him having the ability to jump across universes and hunt whoever he wants, it's definitely a lot scarier. It's a very, very scary too. And seeing him actually crossing paths with both Morlun and the Hunter Spiders, standing on them both an even keel to the point where he's able to actively resist their attempts to try and stop him. It's actually pretty creepy, and it actually does make him look like more of a terrifying motherfucker. Ultimately, though, I think the only character on the Carnage side of things that I ultimately kind of found myself appealing with was John Shade, who was ultimately just a good man who found himself in Carnage's crosshairs to the point where he eventually wound up becoming Carnage's new host. And as a result, I feel more sorry for him in this than I do Carnage. Though I do admit, the idea of a good man being trapped in this monster and attempting to use that position to actively fight other monsters, it's an interesting take. And that's part of like I said, that's part of the reason why John even came to Earth 31, because he was actively hunting for that world's venom, especially since this world's venom was Cletus Cassidy. In his regard, he was actively trying to find someone new to duke it out with, to hunt, and to use Carnage's abilities to take out. And he thought that Carnage would be all for it, except Carnage had bigger fish to fry with Kraven, since Kraven was the one who had inherited the Inheritor's trait. So ultimately, it was kind of a two-way streak, though it's clear that John it was a bit of badass normal in his regard, as while Carnage and Kraven were duking it out, he at least had an off-screen moment of awesome as he managed to trick Cletus into going into a building that had oil spread across the floor, and well, while Carnage may have built up a resistance to symbiote weaknesses, I doubt that this Cletus's symbiote has done the same. So again, little things like that. Otherwise, though, the story itself as a bridge between End of the Spider-Verse and Death of the Venomverse is actually pretty good in that regard. Is actually pretty good. From the one, like I said, it ties back into End of the Spider-Verse as it gives us closure on what happened to Morlun. That he essentially fucked off to some random parallel universe to try and regain his strength, and ultimately, thanks to Carnage's intervention, he finally managed to get enough of a leg up that he was able to at least get a little of his power back. Enough that he can at least keep his mind back in order. So in that regard, it is still something that it's actually nice seeing that, though whether or not we'll see Morlun again in any future Spider-Verse related material is up in the air. I really do not know. And in the case of Carnage, well, this story does help further establish what Carnage's end goal is. He wants to be the big head honcho, and while at first he thought that to do that he had to take on the Eddie Brock of the main universe, he quickly realizes that if he wants to take down Eddie, then he needs to do it a different way. He needs to come into his own power and pretty much just proclaim himself as a true ruler, and ultimately, if he can show enough strength in that regard, he believes that all the symbiotes will follow him instead of Eddie. In that regard, it is interesting, and I like seeing that actually play through in the story, especially with Carnage realizing that he probably didn't need the Inheritor's trait with how addictive it made Morlun, and that ultimately Carnage only got as powerful as he was by just doing his own thing, by carving his own path, both figuratively and literally. And so as a result, I do at least like that it helps set that up, and does still showcase that in the depths of Carnage's madness, there is still some modicum of intelligence, as he does quickly start forming new plans and adapting to the situation, especially since he began to realize that part of the reason why he was sent to go hunt for the Hunter Spider was because the Web of Life was trying to get him back in its skeins, and him doing this is pretty much just him going, fuck that, I do my own thing. So in that regard, I do like that. And even the ending of the comic when John was returned back to the main Marvel universe, and he thought, oh man, I'm glad to be rid of the Carnage symbiote, and yet you see a little bit of the scar on his cheek heal up with the blood looking a little bit more alive. It implies that there's still more horror in the future for John Shade, and that while he may have learned and gotten better because of this little experience with the Carnage symbiote, well, things are still not going to be easy for him, and it leaves the door open for that plot thread to be, rewoven into future stories. So in that regard, it's still very creepy, and I dig it. But on the whole, Web of Carnage #1, is enjoyable. It's alright. Again, to fully appreciate it, I think you would need to read the Carnage series ongoing that came before it, but even without that in mind, it's still entertaining enough, as the opening does still give an explanation about what Carnage's deal is. It acts as a good bridge between End of the Spider-Verse and Death of the Venomverse, as we see what happens to Morlun and how he managed to kind of recover after what happened to him during End of the Spider-Verse, and even the final shot with John as he's glad that he's rid of the Carnage symbiote, with it only to see a little hint of things coming of his blood healing, with despite no longer being bonded to a symbiote. It's still creepy enough. Plus, it is cool to still see more tie-ins back to End of the Spider-Verse, especially since the Spidey that we see in the comic was the Hunter Spider, as well as learning more about his universe by learning that this world's Venom is Cletus Cassidy, which, yeah, doesn't add anything, but again, little neat tidbit. I like it when universes are just different. So on the whole, Web of Carnage #1 is an alright comic. Again, would be better appreciated if you read the ongoing Carnage series before it, but on its own, still enjoyable in its own right. So, yeah, I think that's all I have to say. I thank you for watching. I'm Samuel Johnson, and, well, the next time we meet, well, it's time we actually get into the second half of the finale era proper, as, well, we start seeing how we see what Carnage's strategy is to make himself stronger. And yes, and well, it requires Venoms. A lot of dead Venoms. So, it's time we'll see how that campaign goes, as when we next meet, it's time we actually dive straight into the Venomverse again, as we take a look at the Extreme Venomverse! Yeah, that's the end of the video. Hope you have a good day. Take care.